So thanks for coming back. As we rejoin our discussion, we're going to switch up our order here a little bit. So going to bat next, we have Mark Shields, and I'm going to do almost no introduction here because the man needs no introduction. From the Marine Corps to politics to Georgetown professor to the press, he is a man of many talents, and he is going to engage us now with these many issues. So welcome to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Mary Ann. A man who needs no introduction, I'll be damned if I'll give him one. But as the late Mo Udall said once when he was the seventh speaker at a Democratic Party dinner, we've reached that point in the program where everything has been said, but not everybody has said it. And I am not here as an expert on theology or social justice, but as an engaged layman and a political pundit, I guess. I always wanted to be a pundit. But as King Henry VIII said to each of his 6 wives, don't worry, I won't keep you long. There is a real libertarian political movement in this country, make no mistake about it. And if one has any question about it, simply look at the most recent Wall Street Journal NBC poll, where Rand Paul is a formidable and serious candidate, and just watch him on any campus, where the greeting to him is warm and welcoming, and it's the NSA, it's America's role in the world, it's America's fatigue with war and engagement, and it's compounded and reinforced by the Veterans Administration story and further evidence that government is not working, has not worked. And so that is a reality, and no less an authority than Peter Hart, the co-pollster of the Wall Street Journal NBC poll, the Democrat who does it with Bill McIntyre, the Republican, said to me that Rand Paul, at the very least, in his judgment, would be the Ross Perot of 2016. By Ross Perot, he doesn't mean somebody whose tray table is not always in its original upright position. He means somebody who can define a political race, to change the terms of the debate and the dialogue. And as far as the message of Catholic social teaching and economic justice we've heard today, we are not strangers to the political world. More than 160 years ago, the man who would become our nation's first Republican president, and arguably our greatest president, said, and I quote, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could not exist if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration." Those are the words of Abraham Lincoln. Some 78 years ago, a great Democratic president said that the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. That was Franklin Roosevelt in his second inaugural. Would that we had leadership in both parties who could speak as passionately and humanly today. I would submit to you that over the past generation, there has been an unspoken collaboration between liberals and conservatives in our country. Politically, liberals have deregulated and privatized the American culture, while conservatives have privatized and deregulated the American economy. And almost libertarian compromise has emerged. I won't seriously meddle with your personal lifestyle if you don't seriously meddle with my free markets. A sort of implicit libertarian bargain. A non-judgmental tolerance becomes the highest virtue in a society where individual economic activity and acquisitiveness and self-expression are honored, and where the individual's obligation is to himself. Call it the me culture. What Catholic social teaching summons us to is a we culture. The strength of a nation is ultimately measured by the willingness of the people of that nation to stand together in individual and collective sacrifice for the common good. I think in trying to understand American politics, there's nobody who's more helpful to this than fellow named Bill Schneider, who's a political thinker. And Bill Schneider explains the uniqueness of our politics this way. He says the difference between an ideologue, someone who believes in and subscribes to a defined ideology, and the pragmatist, someone who instead is concerned with practical results, is the difference in American politics and that of any place else on the earth. The ideologue believes that what is right works, but the pragmatists, to include most Americans, believe instead that what works is right. Americans are pragmatists who conclude that if something works, it is right. There is a moral underpinning, make no mistake about it, but Americans are fiercely practical. We've had 2 presidents in the past 50 years who left office after 2 terms at 65% approval. They couldn't have been more different. Ronald Reagan, the leader of modern American conservatism, and Bill Clinton, a new Democrat from Arkansas. Each of them came at a time of economic chaos. Chaos is too strong, but certainly economic crisis in the country. Each had a different prescription. Reagan said he was going to double the defense budget, cut taxes by 1/3, and balance the budget. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But he in fact, 4 years later, when Reagan ran for re-election, 3 out of 4 Americans said they were better off than they had been when he ran in 1980. Bill Clinton came at a time of then record budget deficits in a campaign that was formed and defined by Ross Perot, and budget balancing became very important to the American economy and to the American political world. Bill Clinton came and instead of cutting taxes, raised taxes on the wealthiest Americans, raised the gasoline tax, passed it without a single Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. And 4 years later, when he ran for re-election, 3 out of 4 Americans said they were better off than they had been 4 years earlier, and he became the first Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt to win a second White House term. I say that because I really think that those who are not libertarians, in whose ranks I would include myself, liberals in particular, have lost that sense of optimism that both Reagan and Clinton embodied. I mean, Ronald Reagan, it was said about him, and I covered Ronald Reagan. I knew Ronald Reagan. I disagree with him on 9 out of 10 issues. Didn't bother him. He won 44 states one time, 49 the next. And he was fun to cover because he used to say things that weren't true. I mean, and it was no attempt to deceive because deception was not in the man's soul. But along the way, and it had been a long way, he picked things up. They got on the 5x8 cards. And sometimes they didn't have a strong empirical basis to them. And we on the press bus used to call these little jewels factoids. They weren't fact, they weren't fiction, they were factoids. And one of Governor Reagan's favorite factoids was there are 243 taxes on a loaf of bread. There are not 243 taxes on a loaf of bread. Asked by a young Associated Press reporter, Governor, could you tell us your source for that? And the Gipper, with that 10,000-watt grin of his, said, Reader's Digest, April 1946, you know, right next to Humor in Uniform, I think is where it was. We're in Steubenville, Ohio, in September of 1980. Ronald Reagan delivered what remains the all-time favorite factoid, mine. Trees cause more pollution than automobiles. It's an amazing concept. The next time you're in the New Jersey Turnpike and your eyes are watering from the diesel in front of you, blame a pine tree in Maine. Our next stop, as luck would have it, was in Southern California. It was the worst air pollution inversion week in the Los Angeles basin in 16 months. We went out to Claremont College, where Governor Reagan was going to speak. Some wise guy graduate student hung a sign on a tree. Said, cut me down before I kill again. Nobody laughed harder than Ronald Reagan did. And that was that. But there is this sense of this individualism, or call it with a celebration of individual. Of the 535 members of Congress in office when Reagan was running for the White House, 412 of them, because the draft law enforced between 1940 and 1973, had served in the U.S. military. In the current Congress, just 103 have worn the nation's uniform. Does military service influence public policy choices of a politician? Consider this, only one major presidential candidate in the 2 most recent national elections made the outlawing of all forms of torture of prisoners of war his cause. He happened to be the only presidential candidate who was a prisoner of war, had himself been tortured, John McCain. One real benefit of the draft was that it meant that practically every American family had a profoundly personal interest in U.S. foreign policy. War was not an abstraction. War was not a spectator sport. War could and did kill people you knew and loved and make others into widows and orphans. This included the children of the powerful and the privileged. During World War II, Marine Sergeant Peter Saltonstall, son of the Massachusetts Republican senator, Lieutenant Peter J. Lehman of New York, son of New York's Democratic governor, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., son of the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, and 18-year-old Stephen Hopkins, the son of President Franklin Roosevelt's closest White House advisor, were all killed in combat. And the conservative author Michael Barone has written, War Demands Equality of Sacrifice, Roosevelt's 4 sons more than met their duty. Elliott Roosevelt joined the Army Air Corps and flew 300, make that 300 combat missions. Navy Lieutenant John Roosevelt was awarded the Bronze Star. Jamie Roosevelt, as a combat Marine, earned both the Navy Cross and the Silver Star. Lieutenant Commander Franklin Roosevelt Jr.'s bravery under heavy fire saved the lives of his crew and won him the Silver Star. Nobody captured civilians just checking out or going AWOL from their fellow Americans' harm's way, as well as Jim Webb did in his memorable war novel, Fields of Fire. The book's Marine sergeant returned to Vietnam after a second tour, after a visit to the U.S., reports on the attitudes of the home front to his officer. Lieutenant, you'd hardly know there was a war on. It's in the papers, but that's it. Airplane drivers still drive their airplanes. Businessmen still run their businesses. College kids still go to college. It's like nothing really happened except to other people. It isn't touching anybody except us. By now, we must have learned from painful experience that a nation's strength is only measured by our will and resolve, that nation's people to stand together in collective sacrifice for the common good. Freedom is not free. The late Charles Moskos, the nation's preeminent military sociologist, and himself an Army draftee after graduating from Princeton, offered this insight on when and why Americans support military action. The answer to the question of what our vital national interest is found not so much in the cause itself, but who is willing to die for that cause. Only when the privileged classes perform military service, only when the elite youth are on the firing line, does the country define the cause as worth young people's blood, and do war losses become acceptable. The United States military is, to its great credit, increasingly integrated by race, but through no fault of its own, increasingly segregated by class. It is beyond time for all Americans to put some skin in the game in fighting for our common defense. We know what a draft without exemptions that recruits the sons of affluence and influence will mean. The civilian leadership of the country will demand a measured, extended, and public debate before any future impulsive rush to war. In his landmark work on the American infantrymen, Mud Soldiers, George Wilson quoted combat veteran Steve Siegfried, a colonel of the United States Army. Who said, armies don't fight wars, countries fight wars. When a country fights a war, if it doesn't, then we shouldn't send an army. And I just say that my own sense of what we're all in this together, that I believe in politics. I think politics, in addition to being great fun, is basically the peaceable resolution of conflict among legitimate competing interests. And I don't know, in a nation as big and diverse and brawling as ours, how else would resolve our differences except through the political process. Compromise is the best alternative to brute muscle, to the power of raw money, to just numbers. Compromises that are both wise and just are crafted through the dedication, the skill, and yes, the intelligence of those in our political process. I like people who run for office. I've always worked in 4 presidential campaigns. I've covered the last 9. I admire enormously a candidate able to face defeat with humor and grace. In my 50 years in the business, I've never seen anybody do it better than a fellow named Dick Tuck, who lost a very close Senate primary in Los Angeles by just a handful of votes. And when the radio announcer from KMPC stuck a microphone in front of him, he said, "What do you have to say, Mr. Tuck?" And he said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." So, but I admire most of all the politics of courage. The first time I ever slept in the same quarters with African Americans or took orders from African Americans as a matter of course was at Parris Island, South Carolina Marine Corps boot camp. And the only reason I did it was because a president of the United States named Harry Truman said it was indefensible and morally reprehensible. In the final analysis, you ask men to die, fight for their country, and then segregate them by race. I admired, too, the courage of Ronald Reagan, who about to mount his last chance run for the presidency in his adopted home state of California, faced that irksome ballot question that California voters always vote on, from turn right on red to whether, in fact, there ought to be more Q's in the alphabet soup that Campbell's put out. They vote on everything in California. And this one was the Briggs Amendment, which would have prohibited and made illegal anybody who was gay or homosexual from teaching in the public schools of California for that reason alone, just for being gay or homosexual. And it was leading in every poll. Similar measures had been adopted in Minnesota and Oregon, Florida, Kansas. And it was leading in the polls, and Ronald Reagan came out against it. And he said, that isn't how we judge teachers in California. We judge teachers on whether our children learn in their classroom. And I really do think that we need the politics of the common good again. I believe that national service, without exception, is in the vital national interest of our country, that each of us understands what it means to be an American, that we are a stratified people, sadly, that the case of justice is so important. I've heard so much here today that reminds me of the fundamental and inescapable truth that each of us lives with, and that is that every one of us has been warmed by fires we did not build. Every one of us has drunk from wells we did not dig. We can do no less for those who come after us, and together we can do much more. Thank you so very, very much.